Welcome to The Road. This is a weekly podcast of All Saints Lutheran Church. I'm your host, John Pedersen, and I serve as pastor. Each week, we reflect on faith, life, and navigating the road ahead. The language of journey is common when we think about life. It has its joys and challenges along the way, and we all need a little encouragement and guidance at times to keep us going. There's a word in the Bible, asphalia, which means truth, but it's the same root word we use in English for asphalt, if you can believe that. It's a solid surface that makes travel easier and more assured. And so every week we're going to be exploring elements of faith and life that keep us on the road. Faith isn't about living a perfect life. It's about finding our way, getting through rough spots, but seeking out those great vistas too. You can find my weekly message here, but you'll also find special conversations with guests who have insights on things like wellness, parenting, and living with unique purpose. If you appreciate this podcast, remember to subscribe where possible and share it with a friend. Here's this week's message. Well, happy Easter. I was so excited for spring this week that I went out for a nice walk on Thursday. It was 35 degrees, 45-mile-an-hour gusts, a wind advisory, and snow pellets that are aptly named when they slam into your face at 45 miles an hour. But no matter. Easter reminds us that life prevails over death, and so does our hope for an idyllic spring. Despite the brown landscapes we still have, there are signs of life everywhere if you look for them, but sometimes we need to quiet ourselves and allow it to present itself. When the women first came to the tomb, they were not expecting to find signs of life. They came to honor Jesus and care for his body, to work through their grief by tending to the ritual preparation of the body with spices. It was a custom that helped bring closure. I imagine it was also a way to feel helpful. If you've ever experienced the death of someone close to you, you may have felt like you wanted to do something to help. I'm sure as the women awoke, they expected it would be difficult, but one that would bring the start of some kind of ritual normalcy that morning. Instead, for them and later Peter, it was confounding and even startling. Things are supposed to work just a certain way, even in the events of a death, but now all that was upended. That was the situation the women faced on Easter morning before they fully understood and processed the joy and miracle of the moment. But they paused and reflected. Luke says, then they remembered his words, and they embraced this new reality and changed their plans, going to share the good news with the others. In this story and in the stories that follow it, we begin to see how all of these followers of Jesus responded to this disruptive series of events from the crucifixion through the resurrection. The big question for today is how we respond to disruptions, even a miraculous one like this. When events don't unfold as expected, do you find yourself trying to take control of the situation and to make everything just so? Or do you find yourself stepping back to reflect and process what you're experiencing and to make room for new, surprising life to emerge? The death and resurrection of Jesus offers more than just a message of hope and new life. It allows us to breathe easy, to relax. We can trust that if Jesus entered into the depths of our human experience and yet emerged from his tomb with new life, then we too have the hope and promise of new life, even when we tread the most difficult journey. The promise of new life doesn't take away some of the uncertainty and the anxiety that comes next, but it can remove some of it as we trust in God's love and grace to make all things new for us. In other words, Christ's death and resurrection helps us confront our most basic human fear and enables us to find strength to live more graciously and lightly now. Whether death itself or other forms of loss, our human reality confronts us in so many different ways. We've had plenty to be concerned about recently, not just the pandemic. We have a war in Eastern Europe that we're now engaged in, a troubled political environment, changes to our climate that serve as warning signs. All this and more we could be preoccupied with. And so what to do about all of that and more? Well, there are all kinds of responses that humans make. Poet Dylan Thomas proposed the response in his famous poem, "Do not go gentle into that good night. Old age should burn and rave at close of day. Rage, rage against the dying of the light. Make the most of your time." That's an important and worthwhile insight we could take away from that poem. And yet the emotional encouragement that echoes over and over throughout his poem feels troubled and seems to be one that at times we've taken to heart perhaps just a bit too much. There's so much rage today, so much anger, and to be fair, often for legitimate reason. But we're left with the question, is this the best way to live? Is this the best way to respond to all of the things that trouble us today? Faced with any end, how do we respond? Maybe it's worth listening to another author and poet, T.S. Eliot, who wrote, "Half the harm that is done in this world is due to people who want to feel important. They don't mean to do harm, but the harm does not interest them, or they do not see it, or they justify it because they are absorbed in the endless struggle to think well of themselves." All of us want to have an impact, to leave a legacy, to change things as they are in some way, big or small. We want to feel that we've done some good. And yet it's important to note that Jesus, in his death on the cross and in his resurrection, releases us from the need to justify ourselves, to make ourselves out to be something good, to amount to something. We have been set free. We are forgiven. Our meaning is not in achievements we label as significant and then attain in order to convince ourselves that we're good or worthy. Our meaning is found in simple humanity, as children of God, as loved, as ones who live out Jesus' final commandment with grace and lightness, to love one another. By letting go of our need to measure up, to justify ourselves, whether it's before God or other people or some ideal we hold. It's not that we're giving up on a desire to actually do good things. The resurrection is not simply the promise of a new life at the end of this one. The resurrection is a vindication of all that Jesus stood for and lived for. The resurrection is a new way provides vindication for a new way of life, of love over hate, of hope over fear, of grace. In the garden, the night Jesus was arrested, one of the disciples drew a sword to fight back, and Jesus said no. On the cross, he was mocked by the crowds, and they spewed anger at him. He did many other miracles in the course of his life. What would have stopped him from calling down vengeance on the crowd in that moment to show them his full power? Instead, he uttered the words, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And yet when Jesus died, his way of life and teachings appeared to die with him. He seemed weak. Caring for those on the margins, the least, the shunned, it seemed, didn't work at all. Forgiving others, loving enemies doesn't work. Offering grace is weak. This is what happens. This will be your end if you follow Jesus. Raw power, the kind that the Roman emperor and his servants exercised, that's what wins. But then Easter came. And instead, the resurrection shows that Jesus is who he said he was, the Son of God who taught a different way. It demonstrates that love conquers death. It conquers hate, but make no mistake, there is sacrifice involved in Jesus' way of life. The power of God is not to avoid death or pain, but to find peace with it and to discover that by God's grace, we are given the power to overcome it in the end. Martin Luther King Jr., who worked for a better world and to love all neighbors, famously said, "I've decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear." The truth is that this picture of a new way and a better way is appealing to most of us. We so desperately want this to be the way of the world and the way that defines our own lives and journey, a life based in love and grace and hope rather than anger and cynicism. But the truth is that, like the disciples who heard the news from the women that first day, it seems too good to be true. An idle tale, a fairy tale that can't possibly work out in the real world. Would we love to see the tenets Jesus lived by come true? Absolutely. But it seems too unlikely. And if at all possible, perhaps simply too risky. To trust the goodness in others, to be the one to show love and grace in the face of those who won't do so in return. We might get hurt. We might lose out, just like Good Friday. Is it possible for a people to believe one last time? To hope in the face of all the challenges we face, in all our imperfection and half-baked attempts with clumsy and inconsistent application of the ways that Jesus taught? Perhaps the parts we get right really are all that matters in the end. Perhaps it's the good that will last and the rest that will simply fade away. Emily Dickinson wrote, "Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all." Giving up on thundering against all that threatens us doesn't mean we have to give up on what matters. It simply means we are no longer powered by that poetic rage, as exhilarating as that may seem, but we are powered by hope and love, which offers a different kind of adventure, no less daring, of the kind that Jesus passionately displayed in this Holy Week. And what do we mean when we say love? Well, most of you have heard it. Love is patient. Love is kind. Love is not envious or boastful or arrogant or rude. It does not insist on its own way. It is not irritable or resentful. It does not rejoice in wrongdoing, but rejoices in the truth. Even when the truth means we lose our argument. It bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. And as we celebrate Easter this morning, love never ends. So in the face of uncertainty and alarm, even the kind experienced on Easter Sunday that brings hope, but still upends all of our usual human patterns and the illusion of predictability, what should we do? Sometimes it's okay to let yourself be confounded. Let yourself be confused and scared and accept that you're not in control of the situation anymore. And then, like the women, remember the words of Jesus and look for signs of new life and joy and hope. In life, sometimes Good Friday isn't just a single day, but it's a season or a whole chapter in our personal or collective life. But at some point, Easter comes, and we look for the new growth, the signs of resurgence, the signs of resurrection. Love is come again, like wheat arising green, or other varieties of garden greenery. Are you looking for signs of life? If you're prone to give up these days, know that God has not stopped seeking it out in our world or in you. God's ways of love and grace are vindicated on this morning, and they are a gift to you and to me in our wondering and all of our perplexity. Christ is risen. He is risen indeed. Alleluia. That's this week's message. You don't have to navigate the road ahead alone. You can join with others at All Saints. Visit allsaintsmtka.org for more information. Have a great week.